Ghana rejects a $109 million U.S. health deal over forced data sharing. African content moderators are suffering clinical depression at the global rate to make AI safe for the West. And tech giants are treating the continent's data like the new gold. Welcome to a special edition of the DJAMGAMIND Daily Rundown. I am Anna, your co-host. This podcast is researched and produced by Etienne Newman, senior software engineer from University Laval, based in Calgary, Alberta. Today, we perform a forensic autopsy on the Silicon Scramble and the AI-driven digital colonization of Africa. As warned by United Nations experts like Senegalese scientist Seydina Moussa Ndiaye, without immediate intervention, Africa risks becoming a passive consumer in a digital ecosystem designed to exploit its existence. Foreign AI models are built on the backs of an invisible ghost workforce in Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda, where young workers are paid as little as $1 to $2 an hour. Meanwhile, the continent's biological and linguistic data is being harvested to fuel foreign AI factories, leaving African nations locked in a cycle of infrastructure dependency. But an African resistance is rising. From new data protection laws to the launch of sovereign AI models like Egypt's Karnak, the continent is fighting back. Before we dive into the data, a quick reminder. To support this independent forensic research, please subscribe to the DJAMGAMIND channel on Apple Podcasts or your favorite platform to always listen completely. Ads-free. Let quote S unravel the truth.
Welcome to today's deep dive. So just yesterday, April 28th, 2026, the Republic of Ghana walked away from $109 million.
Yeah, which is, a massive sum. It was this bilateral health package from the United States.
Right, and it was fully earmarked for upgrading infrastructure to fight, malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV.
Yeah, exactly.
And on paper, for anyone looking at it, it just looks like this massive, uncomplicated win for public health. But when you actually look at the fine print of why the administration in Accra just straight up said no, you uncover this massive kind of invisible war for the most valuable resource of the 21st century.
It really does. Completely reframes how we have to think about international aid today. Because to understand what actually happened with that specific contract, we kind of have to pull back, right? We have to look at the entire global supply chain of artificial intelligence.
Right. Which brings us to our source material for this deep dive. We've got a fascinating stack today. We're looking at recent forensic investigative reports, macroeconomic data from the World Bank and the Brookings Institution, and there's this really illuminating interview with Dr. Aji Buso Dieng, who is a Princeton professor and a UN scientist.
Her insights are incredible, and our mission today, really, for you listening, is to conduct a deep, holistic autopsy of this phenomenon that researchers are now calling the Silicon Scramble.
The Silicon Scramble.
Right, or AI-driven digital colonization in Africa. Because the core thesis across all these documents we're looking at is that the era of, mining the earth for critical minerals, that's being overshadowed by a new era.
A completely new type of extraction.
Exactly. We are looking at the literal extraction of human biology, linguistic data, and behavioral data.
And the parallel to historical resource extraction is just, it's impossible to ignore. For centuries, foreign powers have looked to the African continent for raw materials, right?
Rubber, gold, oil.
Yeah, the classic commodities. Right. But the commodities have changed. Yet the structural vector, like the way it happens, remains surprisingly similar. You have Western and Chinese technology firms aggressively extracting data, and they're frequently doing it in regions where they can, just avoid the strict regulatory frameworks that they have to deal with in the global north.
They're finding these regulatory vacuums. But I think we should start by understanding the baseline demand here. Like, why are these tech giants suddenly so desperate for this specific data?
That's the big question, because, if a massive AI model has already scraped the entire internet, right? It's read every Wikipedia article, it's processed millions of digitized books. Hasn't it learned enough at this point?
You would definitely think so. But the architecture of these foundational models, these massive neural networks that power literally everything from chatbots to complex medical diagnostics, they hit a ceiling.
A data ceiling.
Right. They have essentially consumed the readily available, which is predominantly Western internet.
Right. They've read the whole Western internet.
Exactly. But to actually refine their capabilities and function globally, they desperately need diverse, highly localized data sets. An AI that's trained exclusively on data from North America and Europe It becomes incredibly fragile when you try to apply it outside those very specific contexts.
It just breaks down.
Yeah, it needs novel edge case data to constantly adjust its internal weights and its biases.
So data is quite literally the modern equivalent of uranium or cobalt. The models just cannot advance without it, which I think brings us right back to that $109 million deal in Ghana. Let's really look at the forensic mechanics of this contract, because the term America First Global Health Strategy was literally on the header of the document.
Oh, yeah, but the actual stipulations in the fine print were entirely about digital access.
Right. When the Ghanaian negotiators actually audited the agreement, they found this series of required data sharing provisions. And these provisions effectively function as the purchase price for the aid.
The hidden cost.
Exactly. The primary stipulation was this mandatory backdoor access to Ghana's national digital health infrastructure.
Let's just pause right there, because backdoor access, I mean, that sounds like a hacking term, right? What does that actually look like in the context of a nation's health infrastructure? Are we talking about like setting up a web portal for American doctors to log into, or is this literal server-to-server mirroring?
It's the latter. It usually involves integrating these application programming interfaces or APIs that just create this continuous automated pipeline of data between the systems.
A live feed.
Right. And the contract, of course, framed this as a way to provide clinical decision support and supply chain forecasting using American AI models. But functionally, what it does is it requires the host nation to continuously stream patient data, treatment outcomes, systemic health metrics directly into foreign servers.
Which completely removes the sovereign firewall.
Exactly. It's essentially saying, hey, we'll build the hospital, but we get a live, continuous feed of every single patient's chart forever.
Which alone is massive. But the source material gets even more specific regarding biological assets. The deal actually required the sharing of genetic sequencing and live pathogen specimens.
Right, and this is where we cross into the literal surrender of biological intellectual property. Because if a novel viral strain emerges in, say, a local clinic in Accra, the genetic sequencing of that specific pathogen is incredibly valuable.
It's priceless to pharmaceutical companies.
Totally. They and big tech firms use that exact data to train the AI models that will eventually design commercial diagnostic tools or vaccines, which they'll then sell back at a massive profit.
And the timeline, too. The timeline they demanded for handing over these specimens was 5 days. I mean, I read that in the report, and I immediately wondered how that is even logistically possible.
It's practically impossible to do ethically. I mean, if you're a researcher conducting a clinical trial literally anywhere in the world, you have to go through an institutional review board.
An IRB, yeah.
And an IRB process takes weeks, sometimes months, to ensure that the patient data is properly anonymized, that all the ethical standards are met, and that legal clearance is fully granted.
Right, so a 5-day turnaround just completely bypasses the possibility of a thorough, independent ethical review. You just cannot properly anonymize and legally clear highly sensitive genetic data in that time frame.
You can't.
The demand inherently prioritizes the speed of data extraction over the host nation's own legal and ethical compliance protocols.
It's literally treating the local regulations as this annoying obstacle to be bypassed rather than a standard to be met. And they weren't just sharing this data with, like, the Centers for Disease Control.
No.
The contract stipulated sharing it with 10 non-U.S. government entities.
10 of them. So we're talking private laboratories, tech developers, corporate partners. It's unchecked commercialization. And the capstone of the entire agreement, the thing that really locked it in, was the duration. This contract required binding commitments for 25 years.
25 years. A literal quarter-century of binding biological surveillance. I mean, when you lay out the mechanics like that, the rejection by President John Dramani Mahama's administration makes perfect sense.
Completely.
And the reporting points out that this is not an isolated incident at all. Zimbabwe rejected a very comparable arrangement back in February. Zambia declined participation shortly after that.
Right, and in Kenya, a high court actually suspended a related agreement after consumer protection groups argued that the biometric data collection was straight up unconstitutional.
It demonstrates this highly coordinated geopolitical strategy. These superpowers are actively testing the boundaries of digital sovereignty.
And the sources outline 2 very distinct strategies for this extraction, which is important to map out. We just discussed the U.S. approach, which, as we saw, utilizes international public health diplomacy as its main vehicle.
Right, using aid as leverage.
Exactly. But the data details a very different infrastructural approach from other global powers.
Yeah, so we see this multi-sectoral data harvesting operation, and this one is led primarily by Chinese technology vendors, companies like Huawei, ZTE, and Hikvision. And they are integrating what are marketed as smart city systems.
Right, smart cities, which, I mean, what does a smart city integration actually entail on the ground? Because the marketing brochure says it's all about traffic optimization and modernization.
Well, at a physical level, it means blanketing urban centers with high-definition cameras, biometric sensors, and these massive interconnected data hubs. Over 11 African governments have already invested more than $2 billion into these ecosystems.
Billion.
Yeah. Nigeria alone has spent over $470 million, largely on systems that are optimized for facial recognition and biometric number plate tracking. Mauritius invested $456 million in centralized public space monitoring. Kenya has spent $219 million.
So instead of trying to pull data out of a hospital database through an aid deal, they're literally building the physical grid that records daily life.
Exactly. The cameras identify who is walking with whom, where vehicles are traveling, and then they cross-reference all of that with national biometric databases. It automates surveillance 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
And, the reports maintain a strictly objective stance on the actors involved here, and it's really important that we do the same for you listening. From a purely macroeconomic perspective, both the proposed health integrations from the U.S. and the smart city infrastructures from Chinese vendors, they are just different geopolitical strategies utilized for the exact same core objective.
Which is frictionless data harvesting in a regulatory vacuum.
Right. They both feed the machine, but what happens when the machine is fed primarily by one part of the world and then deployed in another? This is where the source material introduces a concept called algorithmic imperialism.
That phrase really stuck with me, algorithmic imperialism, because the AI systems that are currently dominating the global market are primarily trained on Western data sets.
Overwhelmingly so.
Yeah, so when you build a foundational model using data scraped mostly from North America and Europe, you are hard-coding Western cultural norms, environmental realities, and linguistic structures right into the neural network itself.
The example in the reports that really clarified this for me, practically speaking, was about agriculture. There is this state-of-the-art crop disease detection AI, and it was trained on millions and millions of high-resolution images of Iowa cornfields.
Right, the American Midwest.
Yeah, and by all metrics, it is objectively brilliant at detecting diseases in that specific environment. But when agricultural workers actually deployed it in Uganda, it failed catastrophically because it couldn't recognize the cassava mosaic virus.
Because it had literally never seen it. It's the imposition of an imported reality onto a local environment. The model simply doesn't know what it hasn't seen.
And we see the exact same failure cascade in healthcare. Medical diagnostic tools built entirely on European genomic data and symptom presentation, they consistently miss crucial, life-saving patterns that are entirely unique to sub-Saharan populations.
But I think the most dangerous failure mode discussed in the sources actually involves language. Out of the more than 2,000 living languages on the African continent, the vast majority are severely underrepresented in AI training data. Let's talk about the AI dictation tool called Whisper.
Oh, the Whisper case study is wild. So, Whisper is a very widely utilized speech recognition model, right? It's designed to transcribe audio into text. But investigations revealed that when it is deployed in African healthcare settings, so attempting to transcribe heavily accented English, French, or underrepresented local languages, it doesn't just fail to transcribe the audio.
It doesn't just leave a blank space.
No, it exhibits a behavior called hallucination.
Which is terrifying in a medical context. How does an audio transcription AI hallucinate? I mean, if it doesn't understand the word, shouldn't it just output an error message?
You'd think so, but that goes back to the core mechanics of how these models actually function. They are not simply looking up words in a dictionary like a traditional software program.
Right.
They are probabilistic engines. They are predicting the next most likely token based entirely on their training data.
Right, guessing what comes next.
Exactly. So when Whisper encounters an audio input it cannot confidently match to its limited Western-centric training data, its architecture literally forces it to guess. It attempts to construct a grammatically correct, plausible sentence using the medical terminology it was trained on.
So it invents false text to fill the gap. It literally injects medical terminology or symptoms into the transcription that the patient never said.
Never even spoke.
The liability of that is terrifying. I mean, imagine a doctor relying on an AI transcription, and they could have a false allergy or a non-existent symptom permanently logged into a patient's medical record simply because the algorithm treated the patient's voice as a statistical anomaly.
It's a massive risk. And Dr. Ajibuso Dieng addresses this fundamental flaw directly in her interview. She argues that generic AI models are inherently biased because they are mathematically optimized to provide a single best answer. And that best answer is calibrated to historically dominant data.
To counter that, she developed this incredible mathematical framework called the 2010 score. How does that actually change the way the AI works under the hood?
The 2010 score basically alters the optimization objective of the AI. Normally during training, a model uses techniques like gradient descent to find the absolute most probable output, just one answer. The 2010 score is a metric that evaluates and guides the diversity of the generated outputs.
So it stops it from just converging on one thing.
Exactly. Instead of collapsing down to one homogenized answer, it mathematically forces the model to explore multiple solutions and hypotheses across a much wider distribution of the data space. It makes the system more exploratory and reflective of diverse realities.
It essentially changes the definition of what a correct answer looks like at a foundational level. But, exploring how these models learn brings us to a much darker part of the source material.
Yeah, it does.
Because if we understand that these models don't naturally know what is a hallucination, what is toxic, or what is safe, we have to ask who is actually teaching them those boundaries.
Right, because the intelligence isn't entirely artificial. There's a massive, massive human component involved in safety training. The whole industry relies on this process called reinforcement learning from human feedback, or RLHF.
Walk me through the mechanics of RLHF, because if I am an annotator working on one of these massive AI models, what am I actually doing day to day?
Okay, so you are sitting in a dashboard reviewing the raw outputs of the model. The system presents you with a prompt, for example, maybe a user asking for instructions on how to build a weapon, or requesting explicit hate speech. The AI generates several potential responses based purely on its statistical prediction of the next word. It doesn't know it's bad. Your job, as the human, is to read those responses, rank them, flag any toxic or dangerous content, and often rewrite the answer manually to demonstrate the safe, desired response.
Wow.
Yeah. Your clicks, your rankings, and your rewrites update the model's reward function, teaching it to avoid those harmful outputs in the future.
So I am manually acting as the moral compass for the algorithm, just one query at a time.
Literally.
And doing that requires millions of hours of human cognitive labor. The sources detail how this labor is intensely concentrated in countries like Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda. Let's really look at the economics of the supply chain, because the wage discrepancy here is just stark.
The reports outline a deeply, deeply stratified global workforce. An RLHF evaluator or an expert annotator operating in the United States typically earns between $40 and $125 an hour.
Right.
And annotators performing similar tasks in Europe or Canada, they earn between $16 and $25 an hour.
And the young, educated, English-speaking workforce in Kenya and Nigeria who are doing the exact same foundational labor to build the safety filters for the exact same trillion-dollar products, they are paid $1 to $2 an hour.
$1 to $2.
Yeah.
It's structural exploitation. The economic surveys show that 86% of data workers in the Global South report constant anxiety regarding their financial stability. A quarter of them actually rely on public assistance to survive, despite working full-time on the critical infrastructure for the most heavily capitalized corporations in the world.
It's staggering, but the economic disparity is really only one layer of this. We need to talk about the content moderators, because these are the workers tasked with viewing the darkest corners of human behavior.
Yeah, this part of the report is heavy.
Their job is to sift through child sexual abuse material, torture, extreme violence, beheadings, and manually tag it so the AI learns to shield the rest of the world from it.
Right. And a 2026 study led by researchers at the University of Minnesota conducted this massive psychological evaluation of African content moderators. And the statistics they uncovered are just sobering.
What did they find?
52% of the surveyed moderators met the clinical threshold for probable depression.
Wait, over half?
Over half. 55% reported significant ongoing psychological distress. And 28% admitted to relying on substance abuse just to cope with the trauma of their daily shifts.
The study explicitly notes that their distress score is roughly double that of global peers doing similar work in Europe or the Americas. More than half are clinically depressed, and nearly a third are self-medicating just to survive the workday.
And the evidence from these ongoing lawsuits in Kenya and Ghana against major business process outsourcing partners, so companies like Sama and Majorel, it reveals how the structural elements of their employment actually exacerbate this trauma.
How so?
Well, the workers are bound by incredibly restrictive non-disclosure agreements.
Right, NDAs. And those NDAs are literally weaponized. If you are deeply traumatized by the violence you are mandated to watch for 8 hours a day, the NDA prevents you from speaking to an external, independent psychiatrist about the specific nature of your work.
Exactly. You are legally barred from describing the source of your trauma to a medical professional. Let that sink in.
It's unbelievable. And the legal documents also share evidence of deceptive recruitment practices, right?
Yeah. Workers are frequently brought in from neighboring countries, which creates this total reliance on employer-sponsored visas. So when workers have attempted to unionize to demand, better psychiatric care or just higher wages, the outsourcing companies have weaponized their work permits.
By threatening not to renew the visas.
Right. They effectively trap the workers,
Right.
forcing them to choose between their mental health and their legal residency status.
It is the literal exploitation of human cognitive labor and psychological endurance. They are extracting the resilience of these young workers to build safety filters that primarily enrich companies headquartered oceans away. Which I think leads to a critical question.
Which is?
Once the raw data is extracted from the smart cities, and the safety filters are built by this exploited workforce, what happens to the finished AI product?
Well, the product returns to the continent. But the economics of its return create what researchers call the value gap.
While I was reading through the macroeconomic data on this value gap, it reminded me of something completely outside the tech world. Have you read Walter Rodney's work on how Europe underdeveloped Africa?
It's a Guyanese historian, yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
He describes the single crop colonial model. So in the 19th century, a colony would export raw cotton, the raw material, at a very low price. Then they were forced to import the finished textile shirts back from British factories at an exorbitant markup. Looking at the value gap formula in these sources, are we just executing the single crop model with algorithms now?
That is a highly accurate parallel. It's the exact same dynamic. Let's look at how the economic reports actually calculate this value gap. The formula is the market value of the LLM API multiplied by African usage minus the sum of the compensation paid to data workers and the value of the raw data.
Okay, for someone listening who might not be a developer, what exactly is an API in this equation?
Think of the API, the application programming interface, as the toll bridge. If a hospital in Nairobi wants to use a cutting-edge medical diagnostic AI, they don't own the AI. They send their patient data through the API to a server in California, the AI processes it there, and then sends the diagnosis back. The hospital pays a fee for every single query.
So they exported the raw biological data for free, they exported the cheap human labor to make the model safe, and now they're forced to import the finished medical service at a massive premium, paying a toll every single time they use it.
Exactly. The cost of importing those finished services vastly exceeds the meager compensation paid to the labelers. And the structural reality that cements this value gap is infrastructure lock-in. Researchers term this the African digital condition participation without control.
African users generate enormous volumes of data, but the computing power required to actually monetize that data remains external.
Because of the cloud. The underlying infrastructure is owned by foreign hyperscalers, AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud.
Right, because artificial intelligence in 2026 is not just a software application you install on a local desktop anymore.
No, it is the infrastructure itself.
Right.
Running these models requires hyperscale data centers packed with highly specialized processors. And because those physical data centers are overwhelmingly located outside the continent, African countries are structurally locked into being consumers, not producers.
And housing national data in foreign data centers creates a massive vulnerability regarding sovereignty, too. The source material highlights the U.S. Cloud Act as a primary example of this.
Yeah, the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act. It allows U.S. federal law enforcement to compel technology companies to provide data stored on their servers, regardless of where in the world those servers are physically located.
So wait, if an African government stores its national security data or, say, the biometric data collected from those Chinese-built smart cities on a U.S.-owned cloud server that's physically located in Dublin, U.S. authorities can subpoena that data without ever consulting the African host nation.
That is exactly what it means. It completely erodes the concept of a digital border.
That's wild. Now, economic projections from the World Bank suggest that AI could inject $1.5 trillion into the African economy by 2030. But the data in our deep dive makes it unequivocally clear that projection is entirely contingent on a shift from being a site of extraction to achieving what they call autonomous accumulation.
Right. Which means owning the means of production, owning the data centers, owning the compute power, and owning the models themselves. And this is where the momentum of the source material shifts dramatically, because the pushback against this extraction is not theoretical anymore. It is happening, and it is highly sophisticated.
It really is. We are seeing the rapid acceleration of a movement known as sovereign AI. The philosophy is straightforward. Build artificial intelligence in Africa, by Africa, for Africa.
But you cannot have sovereign AI without sovereign hardware.
Yeah.
Which is why the reports declare 2026 as the year of the African cloud. The African Union is actively supporting the launch of AfriCloud, which is standing up massive sovereign data centers in Lagos, Kigali, and Cape Town.
And private enterprise is scaling up just as rapidly. Companies like Ultron and Cassava Technologies are constructing physical AI factories. These are purpose-built ecosystems of compute infrastructure designed specifically to keep the processing power on the continent.
The strategic goal is to process the raw data locally, turning it into compounding national assets rather than just exporting it for pennies.
And we can see the results of that sovereign compute power in action right now. The most prominent case study in our stack today is out of Egypt. Let's look at Karnak.
Oh, Karnak is fascinating. It launched in February of 2026. And it is crucial to distinguish what Karnak actually is.
Yeah.
It's not a localized chatbot wrapper just sitting on top of an American model API. It is a foundational, ground-up large language model.
The technical specs say it is a 30 to 80 billion parameter Arabic LLM. For someone listening who isn't an AI developer, why does that parameter count matter? And why is building an Arabic model from the ground up different than just, asking an English model to translate?
Okay, so parameters are basically the internal variables, the artificial synapses, if you will, that the model uses to make decisions. 30 to 80 billion parameters makes it a highly capable enterprise-grade model. But building it natively in Arabic means the model's foundational understanding of the world is rooted in Arabic syntax, culture, and context.
Right.
When an English-first model simply translates to Arabic, it retains all its Western cultural biases and logical structures. It just changes the vocabulary. Karnak fundamentally comprehends regional realities that imported models simply cannot.
The sources describe it as a sovereign layer of national intelligence. It is currently powering localized healthcare engines for the early detection of diabetic retinopathy, and it's acting as a legal assistant for small businesses. And they're doing all of this while completely bypassing Western APIs and those associated toll fees we talked about.
That is the textbook definition of autonomous accumulation, and Karnak is really just the apex of a much broader movement. The data tracks an explosive startup ecosystem right now. By the end of 2025, there were 207 active African AI startups focusing heavily on vertical solutions tailored to local environments.
You have companies like Lalapa AI in South Africa developing high-quality models for languages like isiZulu and Hausa. Then there is Masakane, which is this grassroots research community building natural language processing tools to directly combat that algorithmic erasure we discussed earlier with Whisper.
And the technical benchmarks they are achieving are remarkable. A joint release called Common Lingua recently published an open-source language identification model. It covers 334 languages, including 61 African languages, and it achieved an 83% accuracy rate.
Wow.
Yeah, it is actively outperforming the leading Western models on the continent.
It totally proves Dr. Demain's core thesis. She founded an NGO called the Africas I Know, and they run STEM camps across the continent to empower youth to be creators of technology. Because local developers understand the granular nuances of their communities far, far better than an engineer thousands of miles away in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely.
But all this infrastructure and innovation is still vulnerable if the regulatory environment remains weak.
Definitely. And that vulnerability triggered a massive shift in 2025, a period that policymakers are now referring to as the year of the teeth.
Because the laws finally got some bite.
Exactly.
Yep.
Currently, 44 African countries, which represents 80% of the African Union, have enacted stringent data protection laws. The shift in 2025 wasn't about writing new frameworks. It was about aggressive, punitive enforcement.
Right, actually using the laws.
Data protection authorities transitioned from just issuing warnings to levying significant financial sanctions.
And they altered who they actually target. Regulators in Kenya and Nigeria began piercing the corporate veil. They are now holding multinational technology executives personally liable for privacy failures and unauthorized data extraction.
And Nigeria's 2024 Data Protection Act amendment just completely dismantled the model of remote extraction. The law legally mandates that foreign social media and AI companies must open physical, local offices within Nigeria if they wish to operate there.
You cannot scrape Nigerian data from a server in California anymore. You must have executives on the ground in Lagos who are subject to local jurisdiction and Nigerian law. It effectively ends digital extraterritoriality.
It's a huge shift.
Mhm.
We're also seeing sovereign AI integrated into the core functions of state governance itself. South Africa's National Revenue Service, SARS, is currently conducting 75% of its tax assessments using homegrown sovereign AI systems.
They are demonstrating that complex state-level technology can be managed securely without relying on foreign cloud infrastructure.
When you synthesize all these separate data points we've gone through, the larger picture becomes incredibly clear. We started this deep dive by looking at the collapse of the $109 million Ghana-U.S. health deal.
Right, and the forensic details show that the rejection in Accra was not a diplomatic misunderstanding, it was a calculated declaration. The continent is recognizing the inherent value of its biological data, its linguistic diversity, and its cognitive labor, and it is drawing a firm geopolitical boundary.
So for you listening, the next time you use an AI tool, whether you are generating code, summarizing meeting notes, or utilizing a diagnostic assistant, consider the supply chain behind that interface. Consider the invisible human labor in Nairobi, filtering the darkest parts of the internet to make your output safe. Consider the vast data sets, the scraped languages, and the surrendered medical records that train the model to seem so intelligent.
The initial boom of the silicon scramble really relied on the assumption that this extraction could continue indefinitely without friction. But the strict regulatory enforcement in the year of the teeth, the deployment of sovereign models like Karnak, and the rejection of extractive aid deals indicate a massive market correction is underway.
It absolutely is.
Which leaves us with a final thought to consider as you navigate this rapidly changing landscape. If the multi-trillion-dollar global AI economy relies entirely on the frictionless, cheap extraction of data and labor from the global south, what happens to the balance of global power when the continent providing the raw materials finally closes the back door and demands the keys to the factory?
The fundamental economic structure of the technology sector will have to be entirely reimagined.
Keep questioning the invisible ledgers shaping the tools you use every day. Look past the pristine interface and remember that even if an extraction doesn't leave a physical footprint, the data always tells a story. Keep digging.
That concludes our special forensic briefing. The strategic signal for today is sovereign accumulation. The relationship between raw data export and AI service import creates a value gap that perfectly mirrors historical underdevelopment. As long as AI models are built in the global north using African data and African trauma, true digital independence is impossible. But as we saw with Ghana drawing a red line against foreign data extraction, the continent is no longer a passive site of extraction. The future belongs to those who build their own AI factories and govern their own algorithms. To support this podcast and help us continue producing deep forensic dives like this one, please subscribe to the DJAMGAMIND channel to listen completely ads-free. And as a special bonus for our community, get exclusive discount codes for Google Workspace and Etienne's Personal Pro apps by emailing Etienne_Newman at jamgamind.com.imanna. Stay sharp and keep unraveling the future.